At the beginning of the film, the story paints a vivid picture of the life of bankers in the 1970s, a time when working in a bank was not considered a prestigious or promising career. The financial world was slow, traditional, and dull, far from the glamorous image it would later become. One day, however, a visionary bank boss named Louis Ranieri came up with a revolutionary idea known as mortgage-backed securities, a concept that would completely transform modern finance and become the foundation for the explosive growth of the U.S. property market. As a result, the lives of bankers changed dramatically. Those who once spent their days hanging around in small, smoky bars now found themselves living lavishly, attending exclusive parties, and enjoying entertainment in elite circles. For decades, money flowed endlessly, and Wall Street seemed unstoppable. However, this golden age of prosperity lasted only about 30 years, until the devastating 2008 financial crisis struck the United States. The collapse began when countless mortgage-backed securities borrowers failed to make their payments, triggering the downfall of major banks and plunging the nation into a wave of unemployment, bankruptcy, and homelessness. This disaster had actually been foreseen by Dr. Michael Burry, a brilliant yet eccentric financial expert, as early as March 2005. Working at an investment firm, Michael didn't look like a typical Wall Street trader. He preferred t-shirts and shorts instead of suits, and he lived a reclusive life, possibly due to a sports accident that had left part of his vision impaired. Yet behind his quiet demeanor lay an extraordinary mind. As a meticulous financial analyst, he noticed troubling patterns and predicted that the booming property market would eventually collapse once half of mortgage-backed securities holders defaulted on their payments. His bold prediction, however, was immediately dismissed by one of his staff members, who believed that the housing market was one of the most stable pillars of the economy. Without wasting time arguing, Michael simply ordered his team to thoroughly analyze the top 20 sales of mortgage-backed securities, determined to prove his theory through data rather than words. Later in the film, his colleague Margot Robbie explains in a narration that the system introduced by Louis Ranieri was indeed extremely profitable for large banks, but it was also a ticking time bomb. It thrived only as long as new mortgages kept flowing in. Once all properties were sold, the bonds would start losing value, creating a massive financial bubble. Understanding this, Michael decided to take a daring step. He bet against the market by shorting these bonds, meaning that when the value of mortgage-backed securities eventually plummeted, he would make an enormous profit. Meanwhile, in another corner of the financial world, a man named Mark Baum attended a tense business meeting, openly venting his frustration about the growing number of Americans defaulting on their loans. The irony was painful. His own company was profiting from people's misery through late payment penalties. Despite his cynicism, Mark was a sharp and principled financial expert who owned his own investment firm and wasn't afraid to question the system. Soon after, Michael contacted his superior, Lawrence, to present his radical idea. He explained in detail that he wanted to short mortgage-backed securities because, based on his in-depth analysis, the entire system was built on fragile foundations. Banks were aggressively offering subprime adjustable-rate mortgages under these securities, often with absurdly easy requirements, meaning the likelihood of massive defaults was inevitable. Lawrence, of course, rejected the idea immediately. The property market was booming, and no one wanted to believe it could ever fall. Despite this lack of support, Michael moved forward on his own. He walked into a major bank to purchase credit default swaps, CDS, a form of insurance that would pay him if the mortgage market collapsed. The bankers laughed at him at first, thinking he was crazy for betting against the strongest market in America. The deal was simple. If the value of mortgage-backed securities fell, the bank would owe Michael, but if the market kept rising, he would have to pay a hefty monthly premium. The bankers, confident in their own delusion, were thrilled with this arrangement. They offered him a modest $5 million in CDS contracts, but Michael shocked them by insisting on buying $100 million instead. Thinking they had struck gold, the bankers eagerly sealed the deal. Michael's move didn't stop there. He repeated the same strategy with several other major banks, eventually accumulating a total of $1.3 billion in these bets. His boss Lawrence was furious, believing the risk was reckless and suicidal. But Michael remained calm and resolute, convinced that the mortgage-backed securities market would soon crumble, or at the very least, stop growing. Before long, Michael's unusual actions became the talk of Wall Street. Among those who heard about his bold gamble was Jared Vennett, who caught wind of it at a nightclub filled with arrogant bankers celebrating their massive sales of mortgage-backed securities CDS. Intrigued, Jared decided he wanted in on the opportunity, but rather than buying CDS himself, he sought out investors who could join the bet through him. He eventually approached Mark Baum to pitch the idea. Initially, Mark was uninterested and skeptical. But Jared persisted, explaining that banks were handing out mortgage-backed securities loans with little to no verification of income, jobs, or assets. Defaults were practically guaranteed, and when that happened, the entire system would collapse like a house of cards. Still doubtful, Mark chose to investigate firsthand with his team. Their journey took them across several housing developments, where they uncovered shocking realities. Many people owned houses they didn't even live in. Some had taken out loans using their dog's name as the borrower, and in one enormous suburban complex, only 4 families actually lived among hundreds of empty homes. They found property after property that hadn't made payments in months, and even met a stripper who astonishingly owned 5 homes and a luxury condominium, all financed through mortgage-backed securities loans she barely understood. Not only that, the banks even began offering their clients loan top-ups, even though many of those clients hadn't made a single payment yet. It was absurd, especially considering that the penalties for late payments were outrageously high. The financial system had become reckless and overconfident, as if everyone believed the good times would last forever. Later, based on the evidence he gathered and his growing conviction, Mark Baum instructed his staff to purchase bonds from Jared Vennett worth $50 million, hoping to profit when the market eventually collapsed. Meanwhile, in another part of the financial world, 2 ambitious young investors named Jamie Shipley and Charlie Geller were trying to secure approval for ISDA certification from JP Morgan Chase, which would allow them to trade large volumes of derivatives like the major Wall Street firms. However, their application was promptly denied because their capital wasn't sufficient. The minimum requirement was a staggering $1.47 billion, while the 2 only had about $30 million to their names. Despite this rejection, Jamie and Charlie weren't amateurs. In fact, they were brilliant entrepreneurs who had built their fortune from almost nothing, starting with just $110,000 and gradually growing it to tens of millions through smart investments and sheer determination. So, although the denial crushed their hopes at first, fate soon intervened. Their luck changed one afternoon when they accidentally stumbled upon a lost credit default swap, CDS, proposal belonging to Jared Vennett, left carelessly in a lobby. Intrigued by what they read, they realized they had just uncovered a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Inspired by Michael Burry's bold strategy, they decided to take a similar bet against the supposedly invincible housing market. However, they didn't rush into it blindly. In May 2006, Jamie and Charlie reached out to Ben Rickert, a retired and deeply cautious banker now living a quiet life in Singapore. They sought his wisdom, connections, and assistance in navigating the complex process of acquiring ISDA approval. After several intense discussions and rounds of advice, Ben agreed to help guide them through the steps. Encouraged by his mentorship, Jamie and Charlie finally decided to go all in, purchasing CDS contracts using every dollar of their available capital. But things didn't unfold as smoothly as they had imagined. Instead of collapsing, property values continued to soar, and banks recklessly kept issuing new loans, even to people who had already started defaulting. This put enormous pressure on those who had bought CDS, because they had to keep paying large monthly premiums to the banks. Even Michael Burry, the man who had seen it all coming, began to struggle. To stay afloat, he sold off every share of his company just to cover premium payments, eventually recording devastating paper losses of up to 113%. Overwhelmed and exhausted, he spent long nights pounding on his drum set in frustration, the only way he could release the anxiety and rage boiling inside him. Meanwhile, Ben, Jamie, and Charlie continued their research, digging deeper into the rising number of loan defaults and the cracks forming in the system. Across the country, Mark Baum and his team were doing the same, traveling from city to city, interviewing homeowners, brokers, and bankers, gathering first-hand evidence of the impending collapse. Driven by both obsession and disbelief, Mark even decided to increase his CDS positions, convinced that the crisis was far worse than anyone realized. After years of patience and sleepless nights, Jamie and Charlie finally saw the first signs of the storm they had been waiting for. News headlines began reporting the closure of several major banks as thousands of borrowers defaulted on their mortgages. Overcome with excitement and relief, the two celebrated, finally vindicated after being doubted for so long. Motivated by a sense of justice, they decided to expose the corruption and recklessness of the financial system to the Wall Street Journal. But their idealism was crushed when the editors refused to publish the story, fearing it would spark public chaos. Disappointed but determined, they turned once again to Ben Rickert for advice about selling their CDS holdings. After carefully analyzing the market, Ben suggested they sell a portion of their contracts, a move that earned them a staggering $80 million in profit. However, when Ben shared this analysis aloud in a local bar, his excitement quickly turned to shame as people around him mocked and condemned him for profiting off the suffering of others. As the housing market crumbled and panic spread, financial experts gathered for a high-profile conference to discuss the catastrophe. Among the speakers were Louis Ranieri and Mark Baum, representing opposite sides of the financial debate. The atmosphere was tense. Louis argued that the market's turbulence was merely temporary, a small setback before recovery, and that investors should continue buying. Mark, however, fiercely disagreed, warning that this was only the beginning of a chain reaction that would soon lead to a full-scale economic recession across America. Although Mark and others ultimately earned enormous profits, he felt no joy in his victory. Watching the U.S. economy disintegrate, with Wall Street, once the beating heart of global finance, now eerily silent and empty, filled him with guilt. As stock prices crashed, countless banks went bankrupt, triggering the worst economic downturn in modern history. Millions of ordinary people lost their jobs, their savings, and their homes. Seeing such devastation, Mark hesitated to sell his CDS contracts, torn between morality and business. He couldn't bear the thought of cashing in while so many families were suffering. But his team convinced him that he had simply been on the side of truth, that his actions had only revealed the corruption others ignored. Eventually, Mark agreed and sold all his CDS holdings for nearly $1 billion. Elsewhere, Michael Burry, who had nearly given up hope, finally saw his long-awaited prediction come true. His total profit reached an astonishing 489%, amounting to $2.69 billion. Yet even with his success, Michael felt empty. Disgusted by the greed and arrogance of the financial world, he chose to close his firm permanently, walking away from Wall Street for good. The aftermath was catastrophic. Over $5 trillion in real estate-related pension funds vanished. More than 41,000 savings and bond portfolios were wiped out. 8 million Americans lost their jobs, and at least 6 million families lost their homes. Property values across the nation plunged to record lows, marking one of the darkest economic chapters in history. In the years that followed, Mark's wife revealed that the experience had deeply changed him, turning him into a more compassionate and grounded man. His loyal team continued their financial work quietly in Manhattan, while Jamie and Charlie attempted to sue major financial institutions for fraud, only to be laughed off by regulators who refused to act. Later, Jamie continued running his small firm in the Bronx, while Charlie decided to leave New York behind, move to a quieter city, and start a new life with his wife. Ben Rickert, now truly retired, spent his days peacefully tending his vast garden alongside his family, far from the chaos of the market he once knew so well. As for Michael Burry, he tried to reach out to the U.S. government, hoping to be interviewed about his predictions and insights, but no one was interested. Ironically, despite being right, he became a target of scrutiny, investigated by the FBI 4 separate times. Eventually, he redirected his intellect and passion into a new mission, investing in water commodities, believing that clean water would be the world's next great crisis. By 2015, history seemed to repeat itself. Major U.S. banks once again began creating and selling complex financial bonds eerily similar to those that had caused the last collapse. This, ultimately, is the story of how four visionary men dared to challenge the supposedly unshakable housing and mortgage market, and how they earned unimaginable profits while the rest of the world plunged into chaos, exposing the fragility and greed that lay beneath the surface of modern finance. And with that, the story ends here.